Why do I call my channel the Expat Animator? Find out why I chose that name and the story behind it on today's episode of the Expat Animator. So why did I choose the name Expat Animator? It's basically because I became an expat because I was an animator. So basically, the story goes, back in 2000, I graduated from college. And for my graduation trip, I decided to come with some friends to Costa Rica. And while we were here, I realized that it was cheaper to live in Costa Rica than it was back in California, where I was from. So a couple of years later, I decided to come back to Costa Rica because I was going to work on my big animation project of my superhero TREP. And I came back with a couple of different friends, and we stayed in Costa Rica for 9 months working on that project. And there's no way I could have taken 9 months off of work to live in the United States and work on TREP full time. But that's what I did when I moved to Costa Rica for those 9 months. Is I didn't have a job during that time, and my sole focus was animating and working on TREP. And during that time, we were able to stay in some pretty cheap places, and actually a few months at a house that was actually free for us. So it worked out that I didn't have to spend a lot of money during that time. And I was able to save up for a couple of years before that trip, because I knew that that project was coming up, and that was my plan, was to move to somewhere cheap where I could take some time off of work and focus on working on that animation. And during this time, I was actually learning a lot about animation as well. You know, I was reading books, I was studying movies or other animation films. I was doing a lot of these things during the same time that I was working on my own film. And remember, this was back in 2002. So there were 2D animation software out there, but there wasn't much information on how to learn them. So I was having to learn a software while I was working on the project as well. It's not exactly the way I would have planned it, but that's how it was back then. And I finally got TREP done 2 years after that in 2004. So I actually didn't even finish it during those 9 months. It took me almost 2 more years of working on it till I finally got that project finished. And then once TREP was finished, I decided to do some more traveling and left the United States again. And during that time, for the next couple of years, I was actually working remotely and able to live in different places around the world. And it was those experiences of living abroad and meeting new people from different cultures and learning new languages like Spanish and a little bit of Portuguese that I noticed I was starting to change mentally, where when I would go back to the United States, I didn't like it there so much. And slowly over time, I just realized that the United States wasn't where I wanted to eventually end up. And I started looking into which countries I might like to move to. So fast forward to about 2010, and I made the leap to move back to Costa Rica. And it wasn't to work on an animation project at that time. It was just to leave the United States for a little bit and see what happened. And fortunately for me, during that time, I met my wife, or my soon-to-be wife, and I settled here. And eventually, after we got married, I applied for residency and eventually got my citizenship. So I'm now a dual citizen of Costa Rica and the United States. And it doesn't mean I don't go back to the United States. I do, or my wife and I do, but we do spend a lot of time here in Costa Rica. So now that I actually live outside of the United States, I'm what's considered an expat or an expatriate. And that all really came about because of my animation projects and my desire to want to make my own animated projects. So that's the story in a nutshell. It's a little more complicated than that. There was more moves in the last 20 years than I put into that story, but that's basically how things happened for me. And, you know, when I started working on TREP, you know, almost 20 years ago, I never was thinking, oh, I'm going to become an expat someday. I just wanted to work on my project, and that's the route that I took. And funnily enough, that path guided me to becoming an expat. And I was just kind of playing with words one day, trying to write a description for what I do. And I kept narrowing it down and narrowing it down until I only had 2 words left, which was Expat Animator. And it kind of had a good ring to it. And so I decided that that's what I would call this phase of my channel. So that's how the name Expat Animator came about. So if you're thinking about starting your own project, animated or not, you never know where that decision might lead your life down a path one way or another that you never expected. And that's kind of been my experience with life in general, is things kind of just happen and take you down a certain path. I'd be interested to know if anybody else has a similar story or something happened to them because of a project that they worked on that they weren't expecting to happen. Go ahead and leave those stories in the comments below if you want. And that's about it for this week. My name's Patrick Davidson. This has been another episode of the Expat Animator. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope to see you next time. If you found today's video helpful, you might like some of my animation classes over at Skillshare.com. I'll put the link in the description below.